Early March 1943. The humid air around Port Moresby shimmered with the smell of oil, cordite and desperation. Captain Paul Irvin Gunn stood before a B-25 Mitchell that no longer resembled anything the factory had built. Its glass nose, where once a bombardier sat surrounded by precision instruments, was gone. In its place, metal. 8 heavy Browning .50 caliber machine guns jutted forward like a row of clenched fists. This wasn't a bomber anymore. It was a weapon of vengeance. Gunn ran his hand along the nose, oil staining his fingers black. What stood before him was a violation of every regulation in the Army Air Forces manual, a mechanical sin that could get him court-martialed. And yet, it was also the only thing that made sense anymore. Because this was no longer just about strategy. This was personal. The man everyone would come to call Pappy Gunn wasn't a rebel by nature, but war had turned him into one. His story began long before the Pacific was burning, in the calm skies over Manila in 1941. Gunn was a civilian then, managing Philippine Airlines, a veteran pilot with 20 years in the Navy behind him. He was a family man, a husband to Clara, whom everyone called Polly, and a father of 4. When the Japanese attacked the Philippines, his world collapsed in a single day. He was commandeered into the Army Air Corps and given the rank of captain, tasked with flying reconnaissance and rescue missions as the defence of the islands crumbled. He flew unarmed transports through enemy skies, dodging Zeros, delivering supplies, and evacuating the wounded. But he couldn't save the people who mattered most. His wife and children were trapped in Manila as the Japanese advanced. He obeyed orders to evacuate, leaving behind the family he had promised to protect. Weeks later, word reached him that they had been taken to Santa Tomas internment camp. From that moment, Paul Gunn stopped flying for duty and started flying for revenge. He would dedicate every mission, every modification, every innovation to one goal, ending the war faster. By mid-1942, the Allied air effort in the Southwest Pacific was collapsing. General George Kenney arrived in Brisbane to take command and found an air force exhausted, under-equipped, and losing ground. His bombers were too slow, his tactics outdated, his men demoralised. Japan ruled the skies over New Guinea. The mountains and jungles of the Owen Stanley Range swallowed entire battalions of starving soldiers, while Japanese ships cruised the Bismarck Sea, resupplying their garrisons at will. The Americans needed a miracle, and Kenney found one in the most unlikely man in his command, a grizzled ex-Navy pilot in grease-stained coveralls who had been quietly breaking rules in a maintenance hangar. Gunn had taken a handful of A-20 Havoc light bombers and turned them into something entirely new. He'd ripped out the bombardiers, welded armour plating into the nose and mounted multiple machine guns that all fired forward. These modified strafers came in low, treetop height, and sprayed death across enemy airfields and convoys before releasing their bombs. When Kenney saw the results, dozens of Japanese aircraft destroyed on the ground, supply dumps turned to fireballs, he didn't reprimand Gunn. He promoted him. "You're my new Special Projects Officer," he told him. "Now do the same thing to the B-25. The B-25 Mitchell was a solid, dependable medium bomber. 2 engines, 5 crew, and a 3,000-pound bomb load. It had already made headlines months earlier when Jimmy Doolittle's men launched from the deck of the USS Hornet and bombed Tokyo. But for the low-level warfare of New Guinea, it was nearly useless. High-altitude bombing against ships was a waste. At 20,000 feet, a freighter could turn and avoid the bombs before they landed. Gunn's mind raced as he stared at the Mitchell's airframe. He saw not a bomber, but a blank canvas. What if a bomber could fire like a fighter? What if it could fly just above the waves and tear a ship apart with machine gun fire before the bomb even hit? He and a handful of mechanics worked day and night, scavenging parts from wrecked planes, welding gun mounts by hand, testing, failing, and trying again. They stripped out the bombardier, sealed the glass nose and installed 4.50 caliber guns in a solid metal housing. Then they added 2 more on the sides just below the cockpit and locked the dorsal turret to fire forward. 2 more barrels of steel fury. 8 guns, all controlled by the pilot. When fired together, they unleashed over 7,000 rounds per minute, 180 pounds of lead every second. It was like strapping an entire fighter squadron to the front of a single plane. But with such firepower came problems. The nose was now too heavy, the recoil threatened to shake the airframe apart, and the heat from sustained firing warped the mounts. Gunn solved each issue himself, reinforcing the nose with bracing, adding vents to cool the guns, recalibrating the balance until it felt right. He tested the aircraft personally, streaking over the ocean at 50 feet, firing bursts that chewed the sea into foam. "She'll do," he said simply. By the end of 1942, enough B-25s had been modified to form a new strike squadron under Major Ed Larner, a pilot known for his aggressive flying and short patience with bureaucracy. Together, Gunn and Larner refined the tactics that would redefine air warfare. Their bombers would come in at wave-top level, fire all guns at once to suppress every deck gun on the target ship, and then release their bombs so low that they skipped like stones across the water into the ship's hull before exploding below the waterline. Skip bombing. It sounded like madness, but in practice it was devastating. In February 1943, Allied intelligence cracked Japanese naval codes and discovered something extraordinary. A massive convoy assembling at Rabaul, 8 transports and 8 destroyers carrying nearly 7,000 troops bound for Lae, New Guinea. If those troops landed, the Japanese would reinforce their defences and the Allied advance could stall for months. If the convoy were destroyed, it could cripple Japan's control of the Southwest Pacific. Kenny knew this was the moment. Every modified bomber, every B-25 Strafer, every new tactic Gunn had built would be tested. The operation would become one of the most decisive air battles of the entire war, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, March 2nd, 1943. Dawn broke over the Bismarck Sea like a blade of light cutting through smoke. Far below, 8 Japanese transports and 8 destroyers steamed southward, their decks packed with nearly 7,000 troops bound for New Guinea. On the bridge of the destroyer Shirayuki, Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura believed he could make it through. The sea was rough, the sky low with mist, and he trusted his escorting destroyers to shield the convoy. They had survived raids before, but today the ocean itself would become a grave. At the same hour, Allied airfields across New Guinea came alive. Engines roared, dust swirled, propellers blurred into invisible discs. In their cockpits, American and Australian pilots went through quiet rituals. Dog tags tucked in shirts, letters folded into pockets, the last cigarette flicked into the dirt. They knew this would be the biggest strike of the war in the Pacific so far. General George Kenny's orders were simple and merciless. Destroy the convoy completely. No mercy, no survivors, no escape. The strike force rose into the sky like an iron storm. B-17 flying fortresses climbing to altitude, P-38, Lightning streaking ahead for cover, Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters arming their 20mm cannons, and behind them, the heart of the attack, Major Ed Larner's modified B-25 Strafers, the deadly creations of Pappy Gunn. By mid-morning, the Japanese convoy was moving steadily toward Lae, unaware that hundreds of aircraft were converging. At 10 a.m., the first attack came from above. 29 B-17s appeared from the clouds, dropping strings of bombs from 5,000 feet. The explosions thundered around the convoy, throwing up towering columns of water, forcing the ships to weave and scatter. But few bombs hit. The real attack was still on its way. Minutes later, the horizon erupted with specks, fast, low, and silent until the last second. The Beaufighters came first, skimming the waves, firing their cannons in long, brutal bursts that tore into bridges and gun positions. The Japanese gunners responded, tracers flashing like angry fireflies, but the closing speed was too fast. Then came the sound that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives, the deep, synchronized growl of the B-25s. 8 aircraft in formation roared in at mast height, less than 100 feet above the surface. From a distance, they looked like streaks of sunlight bouncing off the water. When they opened fire, the sea itself seemed to boil. 8 forward-firing guns per plane, 64 barrels unleashing more than 7,000 rounds a minute, ripped through steel decks, tore open fuel tanks, and shredded everything alive above the waterline. Entire gun crews vanished in flashes of vaporized blood. Wooden lifeboats caught fire where they hung on their davits. Pilots held their course straight into walls of fire and flak, the smell of gunpowder and burning oil filling their cockpits. At 1,000 yards they released their bombs, and the real miracle began. The 500-pound explosives skipped across the water like stones on glass, 1, 2 bounces, and slammed into the ship's hulls just above the waterline. A heartbeat later they detonated beneath the surface, where armour was thinnest and shockwaves travelled fastest. The results were catastrophic. The transport Kyokusei Maru took 2 hits and erupted in a column of flames so high it was visible for miles. The Kenbu Maru split in half as twin explosions tore through its engine room. The Teiyo Maru shuddered under strafing fire, then vanished in an orange fireball as its fuel stores ignited. Japanese troops who leaped into the water found themselves trapped in burning oil slicks. Some clung to wreckage. Others simply disappeared beneath waves turned red with blood. From above, the B-17s circled and watched in awe as the sea transformed into chaos. The destroyers tried to protect the transports, weaving through the wreckage to rescue survivors, but they too were under attack. The Shiryuki, Admiral Kimura's flagship, was hit by gunfire that ripped through the bridge, killing or wounding everyone on it. A single bomb struck near the stern, detonating its depth charges and blowing the ship apart. The destroyer Asashio suffered the same fate minutes later, struck by skip bombs that cracked her keel. Within minutes, the convoy's formation dissolved into panic. Ships collided as captains tried to evade the low-flying attackers. One destroyer veered too sharply and rammed a transport, the 2 vessels locking together in flames. By noon, the first wave of attacks was over. In 40 minutes, half the convoy was sinking or ablaze. Thousands of Japanese soldiers and sailors were in the water, clinging to debris, screaming for help that would never come. Oil fires spread across the surface, black smoke twisting into the sky. Allied aircraft circled like vultures, photographing the wreckage for after-action reports before returning to base to rearm. But the battle wasn't finished. That afternoon the second wave arrived. The modified B-25s came again, their gun barrels scorched from the morning assault, their pilots running on adrenaline and rage. Each crew picked a target and dove in low. They called it mast height, but many flew lower, so close their propellers sprayed salt water. They fired continuously, walking streams of lead across decks until the ships looked like sieves. Bombs skipped once, twice, then punched into hulls with surgical precision. The Taimei Maru exploded from a direct hit below her forward magazine. The Nojima Maru listed heavily to starboard, its stern sinking first as troops crowded the rails. The destroyer Tokitsukaze was ripped apart by multiple hits, her forward half vanishing in a flash of white light. When the final explosions faded, the Bismarck Sea was a floating graveyard. All 8 transports and 4 destroyers had been sunk. Only a handful of escort ships limped away under cover of darkness, picking up survivors. Of nearly 7,000 Japanese troops, barely 1,200 reached land. The rest, over 5,000, were dead or drowning. The sea was carpeted with debris, lifeboats, helmets, ammunition crates, corpses. Allied losses were minimal. 1 bomber, a few fighters, a handful of airmen. The victory was absolute. For the first time in history, an entire naval convoy had been annihilated by air power alone. News of the victory electrified the Allied command. General MacArthur issued a communiqué that exaggerated the results, as wartime communiqués often did, but the essence was true. The Japanese had been destroyed. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea had changed everything. Japan could no longer resupply its garrisons in New Guinea by sea. Its army there would wither and starve, cut off from reinforcement. The Pacific balance had shifted. In the aftermath, General Kenny sent a message to Washington. "The low-altitude attack works," he wrote. "The skip bombing works. The gunship works." He was talking about one man's creation, a plane born from grief, welded from anger, and perfected through stubborn genius. Paul Pappy Gunn had turned a medium bomber into a ship-killing machine and in doing so, changed the course of the war. But as he watched reports of victory come in, Gunn felt no triumph. Somewhere in the Philippines, his wife and children were still prisoners. Every Japanese ship that sank was another step toward them, but never close enough. He was winning a war for millions and losing a war for one. Back in Australia, production of modified B-25s accelerated. Gunn worked non-stop, training crews to install the guns, reinforcing noses, balancing airframes. North American aviation engineers visited to study his work. What had started as a rule-breaking experiment was now official doctrine. The factory itself would begin producing Strafer versions of the B-25 based on Gunn's designs. The first was the B-25G, equipped with not just machine guns but a 75mm cannon, the largest ever mounted on a bomber at the time. The gun fired shells heavy enough to punch through a destroyer's hull, though it was slow to reload. Gunn flew one himself on a combat mission and used the cannon to cripple a Japanese ship. It wasn't perfect, but it proved the concept worked. The evolution continued with the B-25H and B-25J, each more heavily armed than the last, each one a descendant of the machine gun had built by hand in a hangar months earlier. By mid-1943, the legend of the flying gunships had spread across the Pacific. Japanese soldiers called them hell comets, machines that came in low and fast, tearing the sea apart with a roar that sounded like thunder wrapped in metal. Everywhere the modified B-25s went, the ocean turned into a killing ground. In New Guinea they shredded convoys. Over Rabaul they ripped apart anchored fleets. The Japanese Naval Command began moving only at night, creeping along coastlines, terrified of daylight. The air war had changed and everyone knew who had done it. Paul Irvin Gunn had become both myth and mechanic, a man whose genius had outpaced the system built to contain him. He wasn't chasing medals or promotions, he was chasing an ending to the war, to the captivity of his wife and children, to the guilt that woke him every night. When the Allies struck Wewak in August 1943, Gunn's ideas reached their full expression. The B-25 Strafers flew hundreds of miles over open ocean, using auxiliary tanks that he had rigged himself out of spare drums and valves. They roared in over Japanese airfields so low that palm fronds snapped against the fuselage. In less than 10 minutes they destroyed nearly 200 enemy aircraft on the ground. Japanese air power in the region never recovered. The pilots called it the Pappy Special. The mechanics called it madness. Gunn just called it necessary. North American aviation sent engineers to study him, expecting blueprints and technical jargon. Instead, they found a man scribbling firing angles on a scrap of cardboard and explaining airflow with his hands. He had built an entire doctrine from instinct and combat feedback. The factories followed his lead, producing new variants with cannon and armour plates and fixed forward turrets. The B-25G, then the H, then the J. Each one born from the same defiance that had started in a dusty hangar in Townsville. Every new plane carried a piece of him, a symbol welded into aluminum, grief turned into geometry, but war exacts payment. In late 1944, Gunn was still flying missions, now 45 years old, his hair gone silver, his right shoulder scarred from years of vibration and recoil. During a night raid on Tacloban, Japanese bombers struck the field with phosphorus munitions. Shrapnel tore through his arm, nearly severing it. The pain was immediate, blinding. He was evacuated to Australia, where surgeons saved his life but not his full strength. For the first time, he was grounded. For a man who lived in the sky, it was a kind of death. Then, in February 1945, the message he had been waiting for arrived. American cavalry units had reached Manila. Santo Tomas internment camp was liberated. Polly and the children were alive. 3 years and 14 days after their capture, they were free. Photographs from the camp show hollow faces and thin smiles, but in one image, a reunion on an airfield, you can see him holding them all at once, his left arm trembling from the effort, his right in a sling, tears running down a face that had not cried since 1941. He had fought a personal war across half the planet, and somehow, impossibly, he had won. After the surrender of Japan, the B-25s he had inspired flew escort for the peace delegation bound for Manila. A quiet, fitting symmetry. The very machines that had crushed Japan's supply lines now watched over its surrender. Gunn stayed in uniform until 1948, retiring as a full colonel. His chest was heavy with medals: the Silver Star, the Legion of Merit, 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 9 Purple Hearts. But none of them mattered as much as the simple fact that his family was whole again. In the years that followed, he returned to the Philippines to rebuild what war had destroyed. Philippine Airlines rose from its ashes with his help, reconnecting islands that had been isolated by occupation. He still flew whenever he could, his left hand steady on the yoke, his damaged right arm braced against his chest. On October 11th, 1957, while flying through a tropical storm, his aircraft went down. He was 57. They buried him at Pensacola Naval Air Station, the cradle of his flying life. His grave is quiet, but the sky above it still hums with the sound of engines. The legacy he left behind outlived him by decades. The concept of the gunship, an aircraft designed to unleash overwhelming forward fire, became standard doctrine. From the AC-47 Spooky in Vietnam to the AC-130 Spectre that still flies today, Every airborne gun platform traces its lineage to that B-25 in Port Moresby, with 8.50 caliber barrels jutting from its nose. Military academies around the world study the Battle of the Bismarck Sea as the moment air power proved it could annihilate naval forces without a single ship in sight. It is remembered as the day one man's refusal to follow rules saved an entire theatre of war. For the Japanese survivors pulled from the burning sea, it marked something darker, the realization that no amount of courage could overcome industrial precision and coordinated firepower. For the Allies, it was a vindication of ingenuity over hierarchy, of invention born from rage. For Paul Gunn, it was simply the path that destiny forced upon him. His colleagues called him a genius. His superiors called him a problem. History calls him the man who turned grief into a weapon. When you watch those black and white reels of B-25 skimming the ocean, tracer lines arcing forward, explosions blossoming like orange flowers on the horizon, remember that behind those engines was one mechanic's heartbeat, steady, relentless, unwilling to stop. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea wasn't just an air victory, it was the moment technology, emotion, and desperation fused into something unstoppable. It was the crucible where innovation proved stronger than regulation, where a father's fury reshaped an entire doctrine of warfare. Every shell that skipped across that sea carried a fragment of his story. Every ship that sank brought him one breath closer to home. Today, surviving B-25s roar across air shows with polished aluminum skin and noses painted shark-toothed. Crowds look up, cameras flash, children cover their ears against the thunder. Most will never know that those machines were born from one man's heartbreak. But listen carefully to the rhythm of those engines, the syncopated growl of the twin Wright R260s, and you'll hear the echo of Pappy Gunn, still flying low over a sun-bright ocean, still defying the odds, still rewriting the rules of war with every pass. His story is more than history. It's a reminder that in war, as in life, innovation often begins where regulation ends. One man's obsession can become an army's salvation, and sometimes the line between vengeance and vision is as thin as the horizon itself.